Okay, so today we're talking about buff optimization. This is sort of how to figure out which buffs are the best buffs to use for which units. There's normally a bit of math involved, but I want to show you sort of the mathematical version of why one buff is going to be better than another, but I also want to show you a sort of quick trick that you can use to evaluate or compare different buffs or find which is the best buff without having to do a whole bunch of math. All right, so we're going to start off with an example. We're going to be looking at a unit of Chaos Knights, right? And we're going to assume these Chaos Knights have a spell on them that gives them -1 to hit. So these Chaos Knights, they're actually going to be hitting on 5s, which is a 2 out of 6 chance to hit, right? Because they hit on a 5 or a 6. That's 2 chances out of 6. And they're going to be wounding on a 3-up, which is 4 out of 6. So they have 4 out of 6 chances to wound. That's 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, just so people know where I'm getting these numbers. And for the sake of this example, I'm going to assume that we have 36 attacks, just because that's an easy number to work with. But the number of attacks that we're dealing with actually doesn't matter. I see I'm going off the screen a little bit. Let's see if I can bring that back. Okay. So we have 36 attacks, we're hitting on 5s and we're wounding on 4s, and we want to ask, we've got a +1 to hit buff, we could use all out attack, and we've also got access to a +1 to wound buff, right? If we assume we're using undivided knights and they're fighting against a hero, and we've got a hero nearby that can give them the undivided command, they could get +1 to wound instead. And so the question is, do we want +1 to hit, or do we want +1 to wound, or does it not matter which one we buff? All right. So there's a lot of different ways people think about answering this question. Some people will say, I think +1 to wound is the better buff because, well, intuitively, it's harder to use this buff in Slave to Darkness. You need to have the hero nearby. You need to both be undivided marked. You can only use it when you're fighting against a hero or monster. Because of all those restrictions, I've got to assume that +1 to wound is a better buff than +1 to hit. Unfortunately, that's not the case. In this case, +1 to hit is going to be a better buff. People might also assume, well, if they watch the save stacking video, they'll think, well, maybe +1 to wound is the right call here, because in save stacking, we want to improve our best characteristic. We want to find the best armor save we have and improve that. But in this case, we're trying to find... So in this case, you might reapply that logic and say, let's improve the best thing we have. But in this case, actually, we're kind of doing the opposite. Again, +1 to hit is going to be the better outcome. Some people might say, well, it's +1 either way. You get like 1 in 6 extra, and it all multiplies together. So what does it matter? Unfortunately, that's not correct either. One last thing I see people doing is they'll say, well, it's better to add +1 to hit because, more hits means more wounds, means more failed saves. So like the earlier in the attack sequence you put the bonus, the better. Unfortunately, mathematically, this doesn't make any sense because all these things do get multiplied together as just when you're working at what your average damage is going to be. It's just going to be 36 multiplied by 2 out of 6 multiplied by 4 out of 6. It doesn't matter what order you put things in when you're multiplying things together. So that reason for giving +1 to hit is not the right reason. But incidentally, +1 to hit is the correct buff. So I want to show you why, and we're just going to start off with the base case, and then we'll show you the difference between the two, and I'll explain what's happening. All right, so in the base case, we have 36 attacks. We're going to be hitting with 1/3 of them, which is 12 hits. And then we're going to be wounding with 2/3 of those hits, which is going to be 8 wounds. All right, so the base case is 8 wounds if we don't use any buffs. If we buff our to wound value, then we're still going to have 12 hits. All right, that doesn't change. But instead of 8 wounds, we're going to go up to 10 wounds. Right, so we have like an improvement of 2. Okay, and these are average numbers, so it's not going to exactly pan out this way, but this is sort of the average outcome. All right, if we add +1 to hit instead, then we go up to 18 hits. Right, because we're hitting half of these, it'll be 3 out of 6. Right, we're going from a 5-up back to a 4-up. Right, and then when we go to wound, well, we'll still be on this 2/3 number, this 3+. So we're going to get 12 wounds. And you'll see the bonus that we get is 4. Okay, so 4 is much better than 2. Both buffs are doing something. They're both helping, but +1 to wound is doing a lot less than +1 to hit in this example. And that's not necessarily intuitive for a lot of people. I've seen people like even like Allsex Tactics. Obviously, this guy makes a lot of content, but sometimes he does this correctly when he's saying, well, this buff gives you like a 20% increase or whatever. But sometimes he does it incorrectly and he tells people sort of the wrong number. And I think half the time it's just because his videos are so quick and they're not, they don't need to be super precise, or like he means the right thing, but just the words he ends up using don't technically say the right thing. But the one thing to take away from all this, the lesson about which buff is more effective, is you want to look at the weakest statistic that you have and you want to improve that weakness. All right, 2 out of 6 is the worst stat we have here. We're hitting on a really bad number on a 5-up. And we're wounding on a really good number already. We're wounding on a 3-up. So we want to improve the worst value. Okay, that's the rule when you're comparing two different buffs, and they're buffing different things. Even if it's attacks or damage or rend or any of that, you want to look at the worst outcome and you want to improve that. Okay, so that's the easy shorthand, is to just look at the worst thing, but sometimes it's not always straightforward to do that. I'm going to give you another example, and we'll just hit new, chuck the dark background so I'm not hurting our eyes too much, and we'll have a look at a similar example just to apply this sort of thinking. All right, so in this example we're going to be looking at a Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon. We're just going to be looking at his sword-like claws. So we're going to have 7 attacks on the sword-like claws, and then we're going to be fighting some Stormdrake Guard, all right? And we hit on 4s with the claws, so 4s are 3 out of 6, and then we wound on 3s, so 3s are 4 out of 6. Okay, and I find it easier to do all this analysis if you already think in the probabilities rather than the sort of code that Games Workshop uses, the 3 plus 2 plus whatever. Think of it as a probability. Think of it as the number of options that succeed out of 6. When we're looking at armor saves, what you want to think about is the chance that your opponent fails the armor save, right? You don't want to put in the chance that they succeed it. We're thinking about doing damage to them. We want them to fail their armor save. From their perspective, they want to save it. From our perspective, we want them to fail it, right? So Stormdrake Guard normally have a 3+ armor save. We have -1 rend, but for this example, we're going to assume that they are using all-out defense. Right, so their all-out defense is going to negate our rend. They just have a 3-up save. Because they have a 3-up save, we have a 2 in 6 chance. All right, 2 in 6 chance that we get past their armor save. Okay, I hope everyone can understand that. I think a bit of rend and armor save things can be a bit confusing because there's a lot of modifiers sort of happening all at once, especially as we move further into this example. That can get a little confusing, but hopefully by making the evaluation at the end really simple, we don't have to worry as much about all that math. All right, and then after we do all this, we do 2 damage. Okay, 2 damage per attack. And the question in this case is going to be, do we want to use Titanic Duel, because we're fighting against a monster, we can do that, or do we want to use Raw and essentially stop them from using all-out defense, right? We're expecting they'll use it, but if we can Raw them, then they won't be able to use it. And to make matters worse, in this situation, they've already used Raw against us. So we don't have access to like +1 to hit from our commands. We're just thinking about, do we want +1 to hit from Titanic Duel, or do we want to reduce their save by 1 by roaring them and preventing them from using all-out defense? Okay, so in this example, if you use that trick, you don't have to do any math. You don't have to like multiply all this stuff together and then like see what happens. You don't have to work out the number of hits like we did before, the number of wounds and all that sort of thing. That's really just to demonstrate that this works. All you have to do is look at these numbers and see which is the lowest number, right? Well, 2 is lower than 3 and 4. 2 is the lowest number. So in this case, the thing we want to do is we want to improve this to, let's pick a color, pink will do. So we want to improve this to a 3 by using raw, right? If we raw them, their armor save will be 1 worse, and we'll have a 3 out of 6 chance of them failing an armor save than we would otherwise, okay? But if we change this scenario just a little bit, if we assume that they have a purple sun, so this, instead of being a 2-up, instead of being 2 out of 6, right, is already 1 worse than that. It's already 3 out of 6 because they're near a purple sun. Their armor save has been reduced by 1. And we look at the same decision. Well, now we're thinking, do we want to use raw and move that into a 4? Or do we want to use Titanic Duel and increase this to a 4, right? And in this case, you probably want to use Titanic Duel because Titanic Duel doesn't have a chance at failing, right? 3 is the same as 3, so you know you want to improve one of them, but they're equally the same. You get the same benefit from improving your to hit chance by 1 as you do from reducing their armor save by 1. You actually get the same benefit in both cases when they're at that save value. And so what you want to do is use Titanic Duel just because raw has a chance of failing. Okay, that's what makes the difference here. Otherwise, if you had a guaranteed chance at raw, then they would be exactly the same and it wouldn't matter which one. All right. So I want to look at one more thing just before we move on, and that is how we compare probabilities, like these things, to flat numbers, right? How do we compare +1 attack to like +1 to hit? Okay, we want to figure out, let's say if I put my velocity in Legion of Blood, how much of a benefit is it going to get versus like +1 to hit? Okay, and you can do the same sort of trick if you're trying to compare which buff is going to be more useful. You just have to keep in mind that this is multiplied by this, okay? So when we do this normally, when we do this equation, what you normally do is you multiply everything together. If we're looking at the expected damage for the Sword-like Claws combat profile, you multiply all this together, and this is a whole bunch of math, right? There's like 7 times 3 is 21, times 4 is like 84, times 2 is 168, times 2 is like 336, right? 336, and then you have to multiply 6 by 6 by 6. It's divided by 216. I just happen to know that number from researching this video. And then you'd have to like do this divided by that, and you're going to get somewhere about, I don't know, 1.5, right? On average, against this kind of armor save, this whole attack profile is going to do about 1.5 damage. That is obviously too much math to do in your head. It's very complicated. So again, let's see if we can apply this trick just to attacks and like to hit, right? If we just look at these two values and see which one is going to be better. One thing to notice about what is happening here is that 7 times 3 over 6 is going to be the same outcome. It's going to be 21 over 6, right? That is the same outcome as 3 times 7 over 6, okay? This is an important mathematical thing to understand. It doesn't matter what order these numbers are in, okay? And it doesn't matter whether the 3 is over here and the 7 is over here. In fact, all of these top numbers are interchangeable. You can disregard all of these divide by 6s. You don't have to worry about that. Don't look at that bit. So all you have to do, if you want to know which buff is going to be the most beneficial buff for my unit dealing damage, is to just look at this top row of numbers and figure out which one is the lowest. So if we're looking at to hit and attack, it's going to be better to give you a bonus chance to hit than it is to give you an additional attack. Okay? It should be pretty straightforward, but I can understand this might be a different way of thinking to the way people usually think about dice rolls and that sort of thing. But for me, intuitively understanding this really helps with evaluating how good buffs are. Right? Like in the new Soulblight book, we got a monstrous action in the Castelli dynasty that gives us +1 to wound. Now, +1 to wound sounds pretty damn good, But when we look at the Vampire Lord and Zombie Dragon profile, most of their attacks already have a really good chance to wound. So we're usually better off with something like +1 to hit than +1 to wound. And we already have access to +1 to hit through things like Titanic Duel. And on top of that, we're also in many cases going to be wanting to use Raw, because -1 to your opponent's armor save, preventing them from using all that defense, is going to be a lot better than +1 to wound, because armor saves are generally going to be a more impactful thing. So that monstrous action for +1 to wound, it's not a bad monstrous action, but it is much less useful than when we look at different buffs. For example, the Doomed Minions buff in Legion of Blood that essentially gives us +2 to hit. It makes us hit on an unmodified 2-up. So we're improving this 3 to a 5 instead of improving like this 4 to a 5. Okay, like we're improving a much worse statistic in Legion of Blood with Doomed Minions than we are in Castelli with their +1 to wound mount trait. So this is one way to figure out which buff is better if you're choosing between two different buffs on the same unit. But we can actually use this to figure out, if we apply the same buff to two different units, which one is going to get a bigger increase. So the example that I'm going to show you for this is the Vampire Lord and Zombie Dragon. This is a comparison of weapon options for him, right? Do you want the lance or the sword? And how much damage you're going to do on the charge versus not on the charge with the lance. Okay. And it doesn't really matter that actually you do need to see the legend. So let me just rearrange this a little bit so you can see it. Okay. That's a little bit better. Okay, so if you're choosing between a sword and a lance for your Vampire Lord and Zombie Dragon, you'll notice that at low saves, bad armor saves, I should say, the sword and the lance do similar damage, even when the lance gets all of its charge bonuses, right? The lance gets extra rend and extra damage on the charge and has extra rend all of the time, but the sword wounds on a higher, wounds a little bit better, and more importantly, has a lot more attacks. All right, the sword has 5 attacks, the lance only has 3. So sword with lower rend and more attacks tends to do better than the lance, or at least as good as the lance on the charge, and much better than the lance not on the charge, until we get to some really good armor saves. Until you're looking down at the 2+, 1+ range, then there starts being a significant gap between the amount of damage you're doing with the lance and the amount of damage you're doing with the sword. Like here, you're doing twice as much with the lance on the charge, and you're doing about the same damage with the lance and the sword, even when they're not on the charge. So down here, the lance is better. Up here, the sword is better. And I think the breakpoint is about 3+ as an armor save, where you would be like, 3+ is a pretty common save. It's what most Stormcast and Slaves to Darkness have. A lot of armies that don't have a 3+ will have a 4+ save, and they'll be adding 1 to that armor save with all that defense or Mystic Shield. So 3+ is a very common save to see in the game. And so you might be basing your decision around, how often do I see a 3+ save? You might also consider, well, I don't really want to be in a fight where my velocity is doing this lower damage, right? If you're against a 1+ or a 0+ save, then you might think, my velocity is doing so little damage regardless of which weapon he picks, that I'm not going to waste my weapon selection on a combat situation that I just want to avoid, full stop. Okay? So for me, I look at this chart and I think, well, at a 3+ save, my sword is doing almost as much as the lance charging, right? There's a difference of about half a point of damage. So the sword is doing almost as much damage as the lance. Whereas the lance not charging drops about a whole point of damage. Right? It's a significant difference when I'm not charging. So I think most of the time, the sword is going to be better than the lance. This is true for the new book, but it's not true for the old one. The old book, the sword was much worse basically all the time. But in the new book, the sword got it got +1 to wound, and it got +1 attack over the previous profile. So the sword is a lot better than it used to be. But if we can buff this profile with +1 attack, say by choosing Legion of Blood, if we're in the Legion of Blood subfaction, how does this impact these two different profiles, right? Does it have the same impact on both? Because it's +1 attack, it'll add +1 attack to both profiles and it'll increase them by the same percentage. Or will it have a bigger impact on one weapon compared to the other? And I think most people will have guessed there is a difference in the impact. The sword already has a lot of attacks. The lance only has a few attacks. Okay, so by adding +1 attack, we have a bigger impact on the weapon that starts with fewer attacks. And we can see that if we jump over to the Legion of Blood version, you'll notice all the damage goes up because we're getting +1 attack on both profiles. But the damage of the lance goes up more than the damage of the sword. Okay? Hopefully people can see that change happening there. And in particular, if you look at our decision point at the 3+ save, well, the difference between the lance charging and the sword gets even bigger. That's a whole 1.1 point of damage, compared to over here, we only had like a 0.5 point of damage difference. And the difference between the sword when we're not charging versus the lance when we're not charging also shrinks a little bit. It goes from, I think, 1 point of damage to 0.9. So in my mind, being in Legion of Blood makes the difference between whether you want the sword or the lance, right? In most subfactions, I want the sword because most of the time the sword is going to do a bit more damage. But in Legion of Blood specifically, where I have +1 attack guaranteed, I probably want to use the lance because the lance gets more out of that +1 attack bonus than the sword does. Okay. There are some things that might impact this sort of decision. Like if you're playing Legion of Night, you can charge in your opponent's turn. So maybe you have a little bit of a higher chance to be using the charging profile. In Castellar, you've got access to +1 damage and +1 attack, but they have different chances that you'll actually be accessing those buffs. So in those situations, it can get pretty complicated about which thing you want to have in which circumstance. But overall, right, knowing this this key trick about wanting to improve the weakest value also lets me know that a sword that has a lot of attacks gets less value out of +1 attack than a lance that only has a few attacks. All right. So I think that's most of the, I guess, the lesson for today. But I do want to quickly explain sort of why this is happening, because it's not necessarily intuitive for people to just know off the top of their head, like, what is going on with all this? Like, why is it, aren't they all just multiplied together? Why does it matter whether I improve the low stat or the high stat? Surely, +1 is just +1 is +1. Why am I getting this different impact based on different bonuses? So I'll just quickly explain that. I have an image for you. And if you're a visual thinker, I think this will help you. So remember in this thing, we're looking at multiplying these numbers together. All right. So we've got 7 times 3 times 4 times 2 and so on. If we just take two of these numbers, just any two of them, it doesn't matter. If we look at like 3 times 4, we notice that this is like the same as working out the area of a rectangle, right? So I'll just show you visually what I'm talking about. If we had a profile where we had, 1 in 6 chance to hit and a 4 in 6 chance to wound, so we're hitting on 6s and we're wounding on 3s, then out of 36 attacks, and it doesn't really matter how many attacks because it'll just form a ratio, but out of 36 attacks, and this would be because 1/6 times 4/6, the bottom number is going to be 36. Out of 36 attacks, we're going to get 4 wounding hits on average, right? And you can see if we add 1 to our chance to wound, then we only go up to 5 wounding hits. Right? Whereas if we add 1 to our chance to hit, then we get a whole 4 extra wounds at the end of our rolling hits and wounds. Okay. And it's because we're increasing the lowest number, we're actually multiplying the bonus by the higher numbers. All right. So if you're a visual thinker, I think this sort of chart might help you. The other thing that I think came up afterwards. The other way I think to think about it is you might remember in like primary school, one of your smart-ass math teachers might have given you some sort of problem like this. They would have said, you know, first one in the class to complete this gets a Mars bar. You got to let me know what like 36 times 52 times 65 times 3 times 0 is. All right, what does that equal? And you know, some students out there start working out this math problem. They're like, oh, 36 times 52. Oh, I've got to do like 30 times 50. 3 times 5 is 150. So it's 1,500, whatever. But some students will notice that there is a 0 in here, and this whole thing multiplied by 0 is just going to be 0, right? Anything multiplied by 0 is just 0. Well, that's a horrible 0. So it doesn't matter how good your like number of attacks are, and your chance to hit, and your chance to wound, and the chance they fail their save is. If your damage is 0, you do 0. And it doesn't matter what order these things are in, right? If your chance to hit is 0, then it doesn't matter how good your damages or your attacks are, or your chance to wound or any of that. If you have a really bad chance mixed in with here, it's going to get multiplied. Everything else is going to get multiplied by that really bad chance. And it doesn't have to be a 0 for this to make sense, right? If this is a 1 in 6, if somebody uses a cockatrice against you and you're hitting on 6s only, then all of the other stuff you've got, all of this other stuff multiplied together is then going to get multiplied by that 1 in 6. All right. And that one bad number is going to trash all of your other valuable stats. Okay. So really important to keep in mind that you want to improve the lowest or the worst characteristic in your profile, because that one bad characteristic is going to ruin the rest of them. Right? And while we're here, I just want to highlight how save stacking relates to this. At the start of the video, I said some people will think, well, in the save stacking video, we improved our best characteristic. So in this situation, we should also improve our best characteristic, right? Almost right. It's just that the logic gets flipped, because when you're the defender, you are caring about the success of your save rolls, but when you're the attacker, you care about the chance of failure. So if you look at save stacking from the attacker's perspective, well, their chance of you failing an armor save is probably going to be the worst stat in their profile when you are trying to save stack. And by adding more to your armor save, you are lowering their chance that you fail that armor save, and you're generally going to be worsening the worst statistic, right? So when they're attacking, they want to improve their worst statistic, and then conversely, when you are defending, debuffing your opponent, you want to be worsening their worst statistic, right? You want to find the weakness in their profile, and you want to make that even worse. So if your opponent has a bad to hit roll, you want to give them -1 to hit. If they have a bad to wound roll, you want to give them -1 to wound. If they have a low number of attacks, you want to reduce their attacks even more. All of these sorts of things, you know, assuming things like if they've got 1 attack and your ability says reduce the number of attacks to a minimum of 1, that's not actually reducing their attacks at all. Keeping those things sort of in mind, you don't want to increase your to wound roll from a 2+ to a 1+ ever, because that doesn't make any sense. But in general, you want to, when you're attacking, improve your worst statistic, and when you're defending, you want to worsen their worst statistic in their profile. All right. So the one thing I guess all of this doesn't really tell us, this tells us how to compare different buffs. This tells us how to like evaluate the strength of the same buff on 2 different units. But what it doesn't tell us is which unit we should necessarily buff. Right? We still want to synergize and stack our buffs one on top of another, again, because everything is multiplied together. You still want to use buffs on units that are doing that thing already. You want to increase the damage of units that already are going to have quite a good, you know, to hit and to wound and a number of attacks and all that sort of stuff. You increase the damage statistic of those units. In general, you want to power up high damage, like power up your hammers with more damage buffs and power up your anvils with more defense buffs. You want to make Death Stars and make use of that synergy. Right? If you pay a lot of points to get a really good attack profile, then you want to augment that really good attack profile. And if you pay a lot of points for a really good defensive profile, then you want to augment that as well. You want to use the sort of synergy and stack good buffs on top of good buffs. It's just that when you do that, the most efficient way to improve those units is to improve their weaknesses, and to focus on worsening the weaknesses of your opponents through things like save stacking. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that helps people make some decisions between like weapon profiles for their units, or just when they're choosing between different buffs in game. I find the thing like Titanic Duel and Raw, that comes up every now and then. A lot of people instinctively just use Raw, but there are actually, if you do the math, Titanic Duel often is a better choice, really depending on how much save stacking and what else is going on in the game. So yeah, I find this sort of stuff intuitive and really helpful. I like to think about the math of what I'm doing a fair bit, just because I don't like pointless de-optimization, I guess. I don't like making just a suboptimal decision because I haven't thought about it. But a lot of these things are pretty marginal. So for example, on Chaos Knights, they're hitting on 4s and wounding on 3s. The Banner of Rage gives you +1 to wound. That's not the best stat to improve on Chaos Knights. I'd much rather improve their to hit chance, but I don't have access to a banner that gives me +1 to hit. So I'll take the +1 to wound banner. I'll just try and use all out attack when I can. +1 attack, also not great on Chaos Knights. They already have 3 attacks base. It would be better to have some other thing, but giving them the Mark of Khorne so they get +1 attack on the charge, that's still a good buff. It's still adding a fair amount of damage, and the unit has a fairly good profile otherwise. It's just that you can hinge a lot of those bonuses. Giving the Mark of Khorne, they get +1 attack. Give them the Banner of Rage, they get +1 to wound. They're wounding on 2s. They charge, so they get extra rend and extra damage. All of their profile is juiced up, except for their hit roll. Their hit roll is all going through that 4+ hit roll. And if your opponent gives a -1 to hit, it's all going through a 5-up hit roll. Your unit of Chaos Knights is going to do basically no damage, because it's one roll through the whole profile is ruining it entirely, right? So you really, really need that all-out attack on the turn you charge with those Chaos Knights. It is absolutely essential that you get it, and in some combats you just can't, right? If you charge a monster and they roar you, you just don't have access to that, right? So even if you have +1 to wound on your from your Banner of Rage, sometimes it's worth using Demonic Power just to give them +1 to hit, so they can go fight a monster and they'll still do quite a lot of damage when they charge into it. All right, that's probably enough from me. It's a fairly dense video, and I'm exaggerating how bad it is by making it longer. I'm worsening my worst characteristic. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this. I enjoy doing the math videos, and I'll see you in the next one.